Hey turkeys, this is Dan and Margie, and we're the Gen-Xers. Today we got another top 3 countdown for you. The most underrated movies of the 80s.
All right, my number 3, Dan, is the underappreciated movie Highlander.
There can be only one.
It was not underappreciated by me. I loved Highlander.
You did. I watched it several times. For me, it was a movie that really combined a bunch of different genres really well. Of course, there was the sci-fi and the fantasy, good dramatic story, and they sprinkled in a little bit of humor too.
And a little bit of professional wrestling. One thing I remember is the Fabulous Freebirds are there at the beginning. Not really part of the movie, but it just happens to be set in a wrestling match.
In the end, there can be only one.
There is a cult following of, fans who love Highlander, as with most of these movies. And I'm not actually, part of that cult, but I definitely do love the movie. It was underappreciated in my opinion.
My number 3 is 3 O'Clock High.
His name is
Jerry Mitchell. Hi, Jerry.
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 Hi, I'm Jerry Mitchell.
This is a movie that flopped at the box office. Cost $5 million to make, and even to this day, it's only made about $3.6 million of that back.
Fight is on. You and me in the parking lot, 3 o'clock.
Came from promising beginnings. The screenwriters, were pretty popular TV screenwriters. Did stuff like 18, Knight Rider, things like that. It was kind of this big bid for it because it seemed like it had the potential to be the next big teen comedy. All the rage in the 80s, of course. Steven Spielberg was one of the producers. Although you wouldn't know that because it came out too dark for him, so he took his name off. And it is dark. It's a very dark comedy, and it's a very funny comedy. It doesn't really star anyone too famous. Probably Philip Baker Hall, who's a character actor you'll all know when I put his face right here on Margaret's body. High schooler and everyman Jerry Mitchell somehow gets on the bad side of the new bully in town, Buddy Revell. Don't that just sound like a bully? Really? Buddy Revell. He revels in your pain. I think just by touching him, he is touchophobic.
I'm with the school paper.
He was touchophobic?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so he's new in town. All these rumors are going around about him, about how he killed a kid at his last school and whatever. And he is a big dude, man. And anyway, so the film's structured. Every hour, it's counting down to 3 o'clock because Buddy tells Jerry, I'm going to kick your ass at 3 o'clock, right? So it's just counting down like a Western, basically. And he's trying all this more and more desperate ways to get out of it. I'm not going to spoil the ending. But if you've ever been bullied in high school, which most of us in the 80s were, it was all the rage back then.
Right.
Most of our
Very
movies
popular.
were even about it. It's a movie for you. It's very funny, but it was probably too dark, a little bit ahead of its time, I would actually say, because probably that comedy aesthetic would have been more welcomed in the 90s.
Okay. So it looked ahead to the 90s. And I'm glad you didn't spoil it because that's a movie that I want to watch because I haven't watched that.
I think you'll like it.
You say underappreciated? You're correct. I have not had a chance to appreciate it, so I will probably take a look.
I found it on HBO like another movie on my list and probably watched it 6 or 7 times over the next, before I graduated high school, I guess.
Okay.
Only because HBO used to play the same movies over and over. But
Right. Well, Dan, I have a pretty big number 2. It was appreciated for a lot of the technical aspects of the movie, but I think underappreciated for what it really kind of ushered in. And my number 2 is The Dark Crystal. Do you remember The Dark Crystal? Did you ever watch that movie?
No, as you could tell probably by some of my stuff back here, I love fantasy, sci-fi, that kind of stuff. Always have since I was a kid. And that looked like baby fantasy to me, I thought at the time. I was like, that's for posers. That's not for real fantasy readers and fans like old Dan.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because there was a little bit of a trend with what you call baby fantasy. There was a trend in kind of a fairy tale way of telling stories. And The Dark Crystal definitely rode that wave. The Never-Ending Story was a really good example of that, and another movie that I really enjoyed too. The Dark Crystal was headed by Jim Henson. And for those of you who don't know, Jim Henson was big in the 80s and the 70s. The 80s is really where he hit his stride with Sesame Street, with The Muppet Show, which was a big, one of the many variety shows that we watched in the evenings in the 80s, and with movies like The Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal really broke new ground because all of it was done with puppetry, but it was just a good story. You say it was a baby fantasy. There were some very heavy themes in there, and they did present it in a way that was friendly for kids.
Well, those were my thoughts at the time. In retrospect, that's ridiculous, of course. Some people might call Willow baby fantasy or not real fantasy or something. That it ended up being my favorite fantasy movie ever. So,
Absolutely.
no, that was just, weird internal watch real fantasy and gatekeeping of a teenager.
Right. Well, another example of that that's not a movie would have been the book The Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King rode that kind of same wave. It was a fairy tale way of broaching some pretty serious subjects. The movie is fantastic. It looks fantastic. Of course, if you know Jim Henson's work, it just looks amazing.
Dark Crystal. You ever been to the dark side?
I have.
It's coming out. You ever seen Eddie and the Cruisers?
Oh,
That's my number 2.
Eddie and the Cruisers. Okay.
Another big time flop at the box office there. Came back on HBO, again, where I found it. Look, it's a movie that's got 38% on Rotten Tomatoes, even now. But what did Roger Ebert say about it? I want to find the exact quote.
The ending is so anticlimactic. I mean, we're waiting for this big, enormous, earth-shaking revelation, and what happens is just a dumb plot twist.
I'll admit, this movie has a very specific audience. Teenage boys who want to be in a rock and roll band. I happen to have been that audience when I discovered this movie.
I must disagree with you and say that the audience is probably a little bit bigger and also includes older men who also wanted to be in a rock and roll band. Because I remember my stepdad watching this like so many times.
Okay.
Loved it. Loved it. It's definitely a kind of a dude movie.
Probably. It's definitely a brooder. There's a lot of brooding going on about the dark side and what that entails and means and whatever. But it's good. The story is rock and roll legend Eddie Cruiser. That's real name. Eddie somebody. Disappears one day mysteriously and I guess comes back 20 years later. There's reporters trying to find him or some bull crap. I don't know. I'd probably hate it now, but I liked it back then enough that me and my friend Jay watched it 900 times when we should have been practicing our instruments.
Right. I remember, I've sat down and watched the movie through like one time, but I've seen it watched several times by several brooding men. And every time I walk through the room when someone is watching it, the screen is always dark.
Sure.
There's like some car,
There's some cars,
just like
man.
peeling off, like in a rebel kind of way.
You don't understand.
Yeah.
Try somebody doing something like that.
It's mostly that. Yeah. It's a lot of that.
It's great.
We are at the top of our list, and I'm going to give you my number 1. Are you ready for my number 1 underappreciated movie of the 80s?
Sure.
Number 1 is Better Off Dead.
Does it ever feel like everyone's got more going than you do?
It is such a great movie. I didn't put it on mine only because I knew that you were. Anyway, continue.
Better Off Dead is a movie so good that we've reviewed it on this channel, and we have recommended that you guys watch it. And when you do, you're going to laugh, and you're going to get some pretty good little life lessons too. It remains at the very top of my list of comedy movies. It's hilarious. It is so much more than the teen movies, the teen comedies that came out during the 80s. There was a little bit more depth to this, a little bit more to the message.
It's more biting. It parodies teen movies while also being a great teen movie.
So you're Al Myers' kid?
Yes, I am.
You look pretty stupid to me.
When we first met and you were courting me, I was very happy to find out that you were a fan of this movie because it's one of those movies, like if someone likes it, you could pretty much figure you have a similar sense of humor.
Right.
Right. So, yeah. I would say that comedy and the rest of them on this list probably all have a few similar things in common, including my number one, which is also a comedy. They're darker, a little darker than the 80s comedies that are surrounding them, and probably leaning more into that 90s aesthetic, so they're a little bit ahead of their times, and that definitely goes for my number one, which is The Burbs.
All Tom Hanks wanted was a quiet vacation at home.
It's hard to imagine that any movie with Tom Hanks, Carrie Fisher, and Corey Feldman that came out in the 80s could be considered underrated. And it did do okay. It made like $40 million at the box office or something. It opened at number one, but it wasn't a huge hit. But it wasn't a huge flop either.
This movie is bankrupt of imagination. It goes nowhere. It uses a lot of special effects to no avail. And the sad thing is, in a way, it's because Tom Hanks is so popular that this movie is such a box office hit.
As far as I'm concerned, this movie is so perfect it could never be highly rated enough. This should be down in the history as a comedy classic and not just a cult classic. It's brilliant. It's ahead of its time. I remember the first time I watched it, I felt like I'd just seen a comedy unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Both goofy and dark at the same time. Mm-hmm. Tom Hanks' physical comedy in this is incredible. There's this whole scene at the end where he's taken out on a gurney or a stretcher or whatever, and it's just... he's like Buster Keaton in it. It's so good. And I do think over the years, this movie has started to grow and grow in cult popularity and status. It's got some big fans like Bill Hader and John Mulaney or whatever his name is. I'm no good at pronouncing names or pronouncing anything in English or any other language.
It's my favorite. It's unbelievably funny. John Mulaney and I, when we first met at Saturday Night Live, we had a huge... we connected on The Burbs in a big way.
So funny people seem to find it and like it. So if you like comedies and you haven't seen it, go get The Burbs, man. Yeah. It's so good.
You might even find yourself on a research mission to find more of Tom Hanks' comedy, more just pure comedy and physical comedy work. I remember his TV show Booze and Buddies, and that was where he broke out, and he was a great physical comedy actor. You're correct. So yeah,
critically it did not do so good. The LA Times said it was inconceivable that The Burbs even looked good on paper, but that dude was wrong, because this is possibly the most brilliant movie of the 80s. I don't know. I watched it not that long ago, a year or two ago, and probably liked it more. I was probably more impressed by everything about it. And the director, Joe Dante, also did Gremlins and The Howling. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the aesthetic.
We're going to talk a little bit about an overrated movie of the 80s. At the very end of the 80s, I was very tired of the John Hughes movies. There were so many of them. That was his decade. I mean, he came out with so many teen comedies, teen romance, romantic comedies. By the end of it, by about Pretty in Pink, I was pretty tired of them. They were a great movie trope, and he perfected that whole genre. I mean, he really did. He put his stamp on it for sure in the 80s, and we went out to the theaters in droves to see all of the John Hughes movies. But by the end of the 80s, we were done with the teen romantic comedies.
Yeah, and they're good. I'm with you. They got old after a while because it was kind of the same old trope. How many ways can you stalk a girl until she wants to go out with you? Well, my most overrated is probably going to be controversial, but I'm just going to say it. E.T. I found it boring as a kid when my grandma took me to see it. I found it boring when we watch it with our kids. I find everything about it boring. And I tell you what, brother, when those Greys come down, when E.T.'s parents come down, start probing you, taking you up in their ship and doing their experiments, they're going to find it so cute then you'll be phoning home. Trust me. Let us know what you think is the most underrated 80s movie, and let us know where you think we got it right and where we got it wrong in the comments below. And please hit like and subscribe.